the direction which you're pushing is that consciousness is the only fundamental thing in the universe, that everything else, like time, all those kinds of things emerge from that.
I will say that what I believe at this point, I've been saying 50-50 for a long time. I'd say now it's like 51-49 in terms of consciousness being emergent versus fundamental. So I am not convinced of this at all. I'm not convinced that consciousness is fundamental. What I think is there are very good reasons to think it could be. And essentially all of science up to this point has been led by the other assumption, by the first assumption that consciousness arises at some point, namely in brains. And that's where all the science has gone. And I think that's wonderful. And I think it should keep on going. And I actually think that was a more important place to start. But I think there's a possibility that the correct assumption is that it's fundamental. And so that's the science I support. That's the thing I spend a lot of my time thinking about and talking to scientists and philosophers about. And so I shouldn't give the idea that I actually have crossed over into believing this is the case, but it's the assumption I follow in my work at this point.
It's a possibility, an understudied possibility, so it deserves serious, rigorous attention.
And there are good reasons to start with that assumption versus the other that I think we're just now starting to realize.
So just to clarify, when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about the hard problem of consciousness, that it feels like something to, there's a subjective experience. Do we, if consciousness permeates all matter, it's fundamental, is that going to be somehow, is our current intuition about consciousness like the very tiny subset of what consciousness actually is? So like we have our intuitions about personal experiences, like what it feels like, what it tastes to eat a cookie or something like that. But that seems like a very specific implementation of consciousness in an organism. So how can we even reason about something that's, if consciousness is fundamental, how can we reason about that? Like
I'm not sure I'm understanding the connection between those two things, but
when you think about what it's like to be a plant, to experience a thing, okay, we can kind of get that. We can kind of understand that.
There are a lot of places we could go with this. One is there's actually work being done by people like David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist. I don't know if you know him.
Yes.
You should talk to him for your podcast if you haven't. He's wonderful. Great science communicator. He's someone I interviewed for my current project too. So he's done this actually. Okay, there are many places we can go. One is he does work with sensory addition, sensory substitution, and this is going in some very interesting directions and maybe partly answers your question, which is giving humans qualia, sensory experiences that we're not wired for, that human beings have never had before. You let me know what you're most interested in hearing about. But we could talk about things like the brain port. There was actually a study done. I just talked to one of the participants in the study where they were seeing if they could give human beings an experience of magnetic north. So other animals have this this sense that we don't have, where they can feel intuitively the way that our eyes work to give us an intuitive sense of our environment. We don't have to translate the information coming in through our eyes. We just have a map of the external world and we can navigate it. So many animals use a sense of magnetic north to get around, and it's an intuitive sense. So I spoke to someone who was in this part of this experiment, and it was fascinating to hear him acquire a sense not only that he had never had, but that no human being had ever had. So when I asked him to describe the experience, it was challenging for him, and understandably so, because it would be like you describing sight to someone who's never seen. But this is clearly possible, and scientists like David Eagleman and others are working on these. And so I do think it's possible that these scientific advancements may actually start to dovetail with the consciousness research in terms of being able to experience things we've never experienced before. But I do think that at some level, yes, we're limited as human beings. We may be able to find some proof or enough proof to at least assume that consciousness is fundamental, or, who knows, one day actually believe that that's the correct scientific view of things, and not really be able to get our minds around that or to understand what it means, and certainly not to know what it feels like. I mean, we don't even know what it feels like to be other creatures.
Maybe
I
we'll
don't know
be.
what it's like to be you.
um, yeah, I mean I guess that's what empathy is about. That's what I tried to
Mhm.
exercise, is try to imagine what it's like to be
Yeah.
other people,
Yeah.
and then you're doing that even farther
tendrils.
with P tendrils. But perhaps we can do that thing more rigorously by connecting different sensory mechanisms to the brain to do that for all kinds of organisms on Earth. But they're similar to us in scale and the time at which they function, the time scale and the spatial scale.
Mhm.
Perhaps it's much more difficult to do for electrons and so on.
Some of the intuitions I talked about, I mean, I just kind of, I'm taking them for granted that you and everyone knows what I'm talking about. But in terms of the science, in terms of the studies, understanding things like binding processes, understanding just a little bit about how the brain works, and as far as we understand, and that there's just a ton of evidence now to support that our conscious experience is at the tail end of a lot of brain processing.
So it just
And
tells a
so,
story.
yeah, so just a little bit. I mean, I give in the example in my book, I talk about tennis and the binding of the sights and sounds and felt experience of hitting a tennis ball, which in the world are happening at different times. The rates it takes the sound waves and the light waves and the felt sensation to travel to my brain are different. That there are these binding processes that happen prior to the conscious experience that were essentially delivered to us by the brain. And so we can get back into this. I can answer your bigger question first, but I feel like for a lot of people to understand some of the science that already is shattering some of our intuitions about the role consciousness plays, I think is helpful in terms of being able to be open to thinking about these other ideas.